If he wins a second term in office, Donald Trump is publicly and cruelly promising to rip away the health insurance from 40 million Americans and strip critical health insurance protections from 150 million Americans by repealing Obamacare. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, so it seems like Trump has taken a bit of a break from spewing nonstop fascism in order to resurrect a 7 or 8-year-old campaign promise, which I believe was predicated on his age-old grudge against former President Barack Obama. This is what he said the other day on Truth Central. The cost of Obamacare is out of control. Plus, it's not good health care. I'm seriously looking at alternatives. We had a couple of Republican senators who campaigned for 6 years against it and then raised their hands not to terminate it. It was a low point for the Republican Party, but we should never give up. So Donald Trump is resurrecting his 2015-2016 campaign promise to repeal Obamacare. Despite, winning the White House in 2016 and having majorities in both chambers of Congress, he failed repeatedly to repeal Obamacare, thanks in large part to John McCain. An irony of ironies, John McCain being Barack Obama's presidential rival in 2008. McCain saved Obama's flagship healthcare agenda. Now, President Biden has already mentioned this. He's pounced on it, as well he should, because this only accentuates the threat that Donald Trump poses to millions of Americans, including in red states and conservatives, people who also benefit from Obamacare.
And my predecessors, once again, God love him, call for cuts that could rip away health insurance for tens of millions of Americans in Medicaid. They just don't give up. But guess what? We won't let these things happen.
And that's another reason why a Democrat has to be in the White House and why Democrats have to either reclaim majorities in the House of Representatives or maintain and expand their majorities in the Senate to protect Americans, 40 million Americans and 150 million other Americans who rely on the pre-existing condition mandate, because the Affordable Care Act under President Obama tells health insurance that you can't discriminate against those Americans with pre-existing conditions. So if Trump has it his way, that health insurance for 40 million Americans and those protections for those 150 million other Americans go away, to say nothing of the fact that seniors who are currently benefiting from cheaper prescription drugs would then have to pay more. And then you have adults in this country, young adults, people from 18 to 26, who will no longer be able to be on their parents' health insurance, which is also an ACA mandate. Quentin Fulks, who is a member of the Biden-Harris campaign, he broke it down a bit more with Jen Psaki.
A second Donald Trump term would be disastrous for Americans, particularly Americans of color, all over across the board. We're going to focus on making sure that we call out these things that he's saying that he would kill. For instance, Obamacare today is just the latest thing on the chopping block. And it's not really a surprise. There are not many pieces of legislation that actually literally save lives. And the ACA and Obamacare is one of them. And it's no surprise that, Donald Trump, the so-called architect of the birther movement, is going after the marquee piece of legislation from the first African-American president. Who does that? This is something that would literally rip away health care from 40 million Americans. Drive up the uninsured rate.
Do you think that's about Obama more than health care?
Yeah, I think it's a petty grievance from somebody who is unfit and woefully unqualified to be president of the United States. And it's in stark contrast to what Joe Biden is doing to lower health care costs, cap the cost of prescription drugs, life-saving drugs, and make health care more affordable. And so all this is somebody that's doubling down and being completely petty and not focused on the real issues that are impacting Americans.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. It's absolutely the case. There's no rational basis for Trump to want to resurrect this promise. Listen, the Affordable Care Act was controversial when it was passed in 2010, and it arguably cost Democrats in the subsequent midterms. They certainly lost their majority. I believe it was in the House of Representatives. But over time, as the full provisions of the ACA or Obamacare unfolded, it became increasingly popular. And right now, its popularity averages between 62% to 59% of most Americans, which is why the Republicans, despite their best efforts, had been unable to repeal it as they intended. It cost Donald Trump's party in the 2018 midterms because, again, in 2017, that was his real big concerted push to try to repeal Obamacare, and it failed, but it angered the American people. In 2020, they talked about doing it again. And that was during the COVID pandemic. So during an unprecedented, centuries, or I suppose unprecedented in a century, global pandemic, Donald Trump and his party openly discussed and attempted to rip away health insurance from millions of Americans. And many believe it also contributed to turnout in the 2020 election. And there was polling data to confirm it, that was their top priority during the pandemic. So here's the situation. Donald Trump is not thinking rationally, but he very rarely does. This is a wildly unpopular policy move, but that's very much part and parcel of the Republican Party. None of their ideas are popular. None of their policies are effective. They are infinitely objectively inferior in terms of a governing party. Democrats are vastly superior as a matter of policy, but that doesn't stop them either for ideological reasons or just sheer spite. If Donald Trump finds his way back into the White House and then he has sufficient majorities in both chambers of Congress, he'll take another crack at it. Mike Johnson, the current Republican Speaker of the House, was no fan of the Affordable Care Act. And then their attempt to repeal it in 2017, all they needed was a simple majority. Had John McCain, one Republican senator, voted a different way, Obamacare would have ceased to be. You don't need a 60-person majority to repeal Obamacare. All you need are 50 highly motivated Republicans and a Republican vice president to break the tie. We have no margin for error on this, my friends. We really don't. The Affordable Care Act should not be the end of the game, where there's still much more to be done. I believe healthcare is a human right. I believe the United States has the means and the moral obligation to provide health insurance for all of its constituents, all of its citizens. But stripping the ACA from Americans would be a disastrous 7 steps backwards, and it would result in many Americans dying. We cannot afford to take the risk. We can't afford to allow Republicans to take the White House, to maintain their House majority, or to reclaim the Senate. So vote blue in November, no matter who.